welcome and thanks for joining us tonight for this public event. We are recording, so please keep yourselves muted. As always, we're going to have a presentation from Nicolas Langlitz tonight, and there'll be a little bit of time at the end for a bit of discussion and questions. The title of the talk is Charismatogens, Anthropological Observations of a Neuroethical Problem. And I sort of came across this particular piece of work by Nicolas doing some research around psychedelics and Pierre Bourdieu, and saw that the talk had been given somewhere else, and I couldn't find a paper anywhere, so I had to reach out and ask Nicolas if he could give it to us. So very happy to be joined by you. Thank you very much. Nicolas Langlitz is a medical doctor by training, is an anthropologist and historian of science and medicine who uses ethnographic fieldwork to think through philosophical questions. He wrote 3 books, including Chimpanzee Culture Wars, Rethinking Human Nature alongside Japanese, European, and American cultural primatologists, and Neuropsychedelia, the revival of hallucinogen research since the decade of the brain. He is Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Psychedelic Humanities Lab at the New School for Social Research in New York. Thank you very much, Nick. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and for your interest in the Charismatogens talk. So yeah, I'll jump right into it. Let me see if I can share my slides. Great, can you see that? Great. So when I originally started to do fieldwork on the revival of psychedelic research, I attended a conference in 2005 which was this LSD symposium in honor of Albert Hofmann's 100th birthday. And I subsequently had a conversation with a psychopharmacologist in Franz Vollenweider's lab who was very distressed by the event. And I'll give you a quote from my interview with him. He said, "What I find interesting about the field of hallucinogen research is that some figures are treated like icons. They are adored and worshipped. Take Albert Hofmann, for example. There are people getting down on their knees in front of him, kissing his feet. And the conference hall is filled by a cheering crowd, and some are dancing on the stage. And I can attest to all of that. So I think that's an accurate description of what happened at the end of the conference. There is a discipleship. There is no doubt that Hofmann has made a large number of highly significant contributions to drug research from a natural scientific point of view. But let's compare him to, for example, Martin Schwab, who was a renowned neuroscientist at the University of Zurich. I can take any neuroscience textbook covering the regeneration of the spinal cord injury, and I will find his name. When it will be possible to cure paraplegia, he will have contributed a lot to that. But are there people dancing for him at a congress or kissing his feet? No, that doesn't happen. Why? Because these groups with mystical leanings need a god whom they can adore. They need a leader. But if you work as a natural scientist, you don't need this kind of thing. Hoffmann and Schwab, they're both doing research on neural systems, but their followers are completely different. So I take that as a starting point to think a little bit about why it is that from the 1960s to the psychedelic renaissance, the psychedelic field has produced more than its fair share of charismatics. Just think of Timothy Leary, Ken Casey, Samuel Wittmer, Martin Ball, maybe Albert Hofmann, or maybe not. We'll talk about that. I'm basically trying to answer 2 questions today. One is, why is that? Why are there so many charismatics? And secondly, how should we assess this phenomenon? So my conceptual starting point is the sociologist Max Weber's concept of charisma, which he laid out in now classical article titled Three Types of Legitimate Authority from 1922, in which he distinguished between traditional authority, which is based on inherited privilege, bureaucratic authority, which is based on competence, for example, the competence of a civil servant or of a scientific expert, so that's the maximally rational pole of modernity, and then charismatic authority, which is based on the leader's personal charisma as a gift of grace, which can be rooted in magical abilities, revelations this person had, their heroism on the battlefield, something of that sort. And that's the maximally irrational pole of modern authority. And charisma requires the always new, the extraordinary, and on the part of the disciples, an affective devotion to their leader. It therefore has an authoritarian bent, but it also has an anti-authoritarian side, at least as far as the leader is concerned, because the leader tells his followers, "It is written, but I say unto you." In other words, I'm going to break conventions. So this is an authority that is not based on the established social order, because that order is precisely what's creating all the problems and in the eyes of the charismatic, and therefore the charismatic stands up and challenges this order. There is a second, more contemporary version of the concept of charisma, which also informed my thinking about this, and that is Jim Forbian's notion of charisma. So Forbian has argued that the charismatic responds to a sense of crisis by advocating a break with the old moral order and for the creation of a new one. And Forbian describes this as the primal scene of ethics. The charismatic leader is an unethical actor who's not subjected to moral norms, but sees himself as a law unto himself. He's a radical revisionist and even a revolutionary. But it's important to emphasize that unethical doesn't mean unethical. Unethical actors cultivate an ethos of sovereignty vis-a-vis moral norms. They care about ethics, but they don't recognize their own subjection to an established moral order. And charismatic action is fundamentally unroutinized, whereas ethical practices are all about routinization. So the charismatic is simultaneously central to and outside a definite form of ethical life. Okay, now I want to flesh this out a little bit in the context of the history of psychedelics, and I'll present three case studies. First case study is Timothy Leary. So Leary offered a critique of modern life. He saw a crisis of individual freedom in a repressive society and fashioned himself as the high priest of LSD, who preached its use as a way out of that crisis. Leary argued that all political problems were psychological and thus neurological at heart, and the neurotechnology of LSD would undo the social conditioning by a misguided and corrupt society and would enable people to discover that their brain was God. Leary broke with academic etiquette, with disciplinary norms, and even the law in the name of a new form of life. And for that, he was fired from his job at Harvard, and he was imprisoned. Now, Leary is no pure charismatic, but he was also a mystic and a trickster. So the charismatic side of Leary was very much engaged in this sort of charismatic rebel rousing. He wanted to throw neurological bombs and destroy a repressive robot society and instigate a molecular revolution. But then there was also another side to him that was more about a mystical form of quietism. And as a mystic, Leary suggested that people shouldn't vote, don't politic. There is nothing you can do about America politically. It's the turn on, tune in, drop out Leary. And then he also was a trickster. So the trickster is someone who uses his intellect to disobey normal rules and defy conventional behavior, playfully disrupting normal life and then reestablishing it on a new basis. So I think the best example for that is the interview that Leary gave to Playboy, in which he claimed that LSD could give women hundreds of orgasms. And when he was later on asked why he would spread such an obvious falsehood, he basically said, tongue-in-cheek, well, you know, if I had given an interview to a soccer magazine, I would have said that LSD helps you score lots of goals. I think this is not a very charismatic position, because he is sort of self-ironic in this. And he basically demonstrates that he has liberated himself from himself with the help of LSD by not taking himself entirely seriously. So it is a gesture that wins him more followers, I suspect, but it is different from this heroic muscular position that the charismatic takes. And I'm emphasizing that, you know, there's like different sides to Leary, because the concept of the charismatic is what Weber would have called an ideal type, and no historical figure ever entirely conforms with an ideal type, and Leary is no exception from that. A somewhat more clear-cut case of a charismatic figure is Samuel Wittmer. My second case. So Wittmer was born in 1948, died in 2017. He, in the late 1980s to mid 1990s, he was the training psychotherapist of the Swiss Medical Association for Psycholytic Therapy, or ZEPT, which is an important group today in the Switzerland's limited medical use program. I just wrote an article about that. So this organization, ZEPT, eventually broke with him in the mid-90s because of Wittmer's guruism. And then Wittmer went off and started a sect-like community offering true psychotherapy guided by love and catalyzed by MDMA, LSD, and 2CB. This group was called the Kirschblüten Community. I think they still exist. They comprise around 200 members and are located in village in Switzerland called Lüsslingen-Nenninghofen. I think Wittmer was a textbook charismatic. So he led his followers, or claimed to lead his followers out of a spiritual crisis, which he described as the darkest hour of meaninglessness and hopelessness, a world in agony. He penetrated the secret of life, was driven by love, and had achieved complete self-transcendence. And he channeled a force that was much larger than him and that defined his extraordinariness. His social critique was actually very similar to Leary's. Society fostered conformism, but his true psychotherapy would give patients the courage to become themselves, even if this made them outsiders in that society. He very clearly broke with conventional morality in the name of unethical values. He encouraged patients to confront all taboos that prevent self-knowledge and truthfulness. He was opposed to the incest taboo and had sex with patients as part of their therapy. And he did all of that in the name of a revolution of love against the authorities, especially against the Swiss Federal Office of Public Health, and against a heartless society. A heartless form of psychiatry. Okay, so I think Wittmer is the most clear-cut, almost ideal, typical charismatic. Now, my last case is Albert Hoffmann. who had discovered LSD in 1943. But Hoffman occupies the structural position of the charismatic only in part. So there is also a mythical narrative spun around the discovery of LSD amid the crisis of World War II. Hoffman had diverged from the Sandoz protocol following what he called a peculiar presentiment, and that enabled him to discover this substance as something truly extraordinary. He, at least later in his life, also articulated a social critique and diagnosed a crisis. He believed that the dualist separation of the material and the spiritual world had led to an ecological catastrophe, and was hoping that LSD would help people to overcome this. He had a mystical revelation as a boy, which later on he basically replicated or had like echoes of that in his LSD experiences. And that was about a vision of unity with all other forms of life. And he hoped that this would be advanced by psychedelic retreat centers. And Hoffman, as the psychopharmacologist I quoted at the outset, had a real followership. So when he celebrated his 100th birthday, Felix Hasler, who was a other psychopharmacologist in the Vollenweider lab who doubled as a science journalist, wrote an article about the event that was titled "Everybody Loves Albert." And I can totally attest to that. I mean, from kind of hippie figures to very conservative Swiss technocrats that I interviewed, everybody loved Albert Hoffman. But Hoffman did not break conventions, and he did not advocate any kind of revolution. In fact, he was highly critical of Timothy Leary and refused to write a preface to Samuel Wittmer's book on true psychotherapy. So I think, in terms of these Weberian ideal types, he was not a charismatic, but a mystic who was aiming for a dissolution of the ego, but not for the kind of muscular challenge to the social order that you see in Wittmer and in Leary when he wasn't about turning on, tuning in, and dropping out. Okay, now what do psychedelics have to do with charisma? I think there is a number of reasons why these charismatic figures are overrepresented in the psychedelic field. First of all, psychedelics have been prohibited, and the higher prevalence of charismatics in the psychedelic field compared with the general population has to do with the fact that most people in the psychedelic field broke the law by taking illegal psychedelics, and that was their admission ticket to the field. So that might be changing now with social experiments like Oregon and so on. But for the longest time, that has been the way the people got into psychedelics. So the charismatic is a law unto himself, and you already have a population of people who basically took the drug law into their own hands here. Secondly, psychedelic use has been legitimized through all sorts of crisis narratives then and now. World War II, the Cold War with nuclear Armageddon on the horizon, the Vietnam War in the 60s. Now it's environmental and climate crisis, or mental health crisis, or some spiritual crisis. And for every crisis, there is a charismatic somewhere to show us a way out. Then psychedelics are known to induce so-called noetic experiences that give people a powerful sense of direct, undeniable knowledge of something that is more real than real. they give people a belief in their own insight and power. So the charismatic receives a message to pass on with an air of self-assurance. I once interviewed a DMT researcher who had participated in the pilot experiment of his study and told me in an interview, I thought, this is how a guru must feel who stands in front of his disciples and says, I have to tell you something important. Listen carefully. Interestingly, this researcher did not become a charismatic, but regained a skeptical attitude toward these experiences. And I think that's a very something that needs more exploration. Why is it that some people go down this charismatic path and other people take different routes and yeah, don't end up being convinced by the truth that they have experienced. And then on the side of the receiving end of this, on the audience side, psychedelics make more suggestible. So the charismatics message is more readily received by followers. And psychedelics allow those who give them out to others to induce a break with ordinary consciousness. So it's almost like working miracles. And this can include a break with the norms of ordinary life. So you see a lot of funny clothes at psychedelic conferences. In psychedelic-assisted therapy, you have transgressions of bodily boundaries and so on. So there is something kind of about the whole experience that kind of disrupts those norms of ordinary life. Thereby, psychedelics enable rather ordinary people, like professors of personality psychology or doctors or publicists, to become what Bourdieu called petty entrepreneurs of salvation, who compete with other charismatics over a quasi-religious field. And of course, they also compete with, the kind of churches, that is, the established institutions. So I think, this is a phenomenon that should be the object of a sociopharmacology that studies how drug action and social context interact when psychedelics serve as charismatogens. So I call this talk an anthropological observation of a neuroethical problem. So I should tell you a little bit about what I think the neuroethical problem is. So first of all, following charismatics is incommensurable with the Enlightenment conception of thinking for oneself without the guidance from another, right? This was Kant's definition of the Enlightenment. But the question is, under what circumstances should we seek guidance from others? Because in psychotherapy, it's pretty clear that people are doing that, and for good reasons. Then following a charismatic is incommensurable with the modern ideal or the ideal of modern psychotherapy to respect and advance the patient's autonomy. However, Wittmer's true psychotherapy was meant to rid patients of social conformism and to enable authenticity. So what kind of autonomy should psychedelic-assisted therapy advance, and when does the therapist become a guru? This is, by the way, something that Alex Garin and I have written about in a paper titled Psychedelic Therapy as a Form of Life. There is a bit of a paradox of following the charismatic to become free. Is identification with the charismatic compatible with becoming oneself and becoming an autonomous self? And then there is the breaking of conventions, which leads to transgressive behavior. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the context of dual relationships and psychedelic-assisted therapies. In the extreme case, this is sexual acts, as in the Jensen-Buisson case. But it could also be something like Michael Fisher advocating for friendships between therapists and their clients. But of course, the questions again is transgression of social conventions could also be seen as the right thing. For example, underground psychedelic therapies defied prohibition, and the therapists certainly believed that they were helping their patients. And maybe psychotherapy more generally transgresses the norms of ordinary life, because people talk about all sorts of things in psychotherapy that would not be the topic of a regular dinner conversation. So how to tell good from bad transgressions? Now, as an anthropologist, I'm not going to give you answers to those questions. I just want to give you a bit of an analytic framework and a bigger picture. So I think a good analysis of the moral economy of the psychedelic renaissance can be derived from Jim Fabian's suggestion to think of the economy of ethical valuation as spread between a determinate pole and an indeterminate pole. So on the determinate end, you have codified rules and values, and they're policed and so on. And on the indeterminate end, you have charismatic transformation and creation of new values. You have the mystical pursuit of states beyond good and evil. So you have all sorts of unethical values. And historically, I would argue that the original psychedelia of the 1960s leaned towards the indeterminate pole, with lots of psychedelic prophets and the counterculture and sexual liberation and exploitation, with free self-experimentation and hardly controlled experiments on human subjects. IRBs and drug policies were only just emerging at the time. And by contrast, today's psychedelic renaissance has really shifted the field towards the determinate pole. It's very much about IRBs, ethics guidelines, consensus statements, treatment manuals, video monitoring of therapies, adherence ratings, watchdog organizations like symposia, social media shitstorms. It's a much more robust system of social control and routinization of action through ethical practices. And charismatics are being weeded out in this. So the sociologist Danielle Gifford wrote a book in which she showed that the renaissance of psychedelic science has very much defined itself in opposition to Timothy Leary as the bad expert. When you talk to people at ZEP, the Swiss Psychedelic Medical Association, they very much define their organization through this break with Samuel Wittmer's irresponsible guruism. When you listen to people at the Mind Foundation in Berlin, you can hear them rail against heroic psychonauts. Symposia, this watchdog organization, has a podcast +3, and in which they have called out abusive therapists as well as the unprofessional professionals working at MAPS. So there is a lot of this pressure on people to basically fall in line with the kind of more normative structure of the psychedelic renaissance. However, there is still space for celebration and adoration of mystics like Hoffman, or Roland Griffiths, I think, is another case in point. If you think of the big dinner shortly before his death at the Denver MAPS conference in 2023. So there is a lot of formalization, systematization, and thus rationalization of ethics going on in the psychedelic renaissance. And overall, it seems that the bureaucratic authority trumps charismatic authority. And that's something that Weber was very uneasy about in his diagnosis of modernity. He described modernity as an iron cage for that reason. And for me, the question is basically, what is the social function of charismatics as we are losing them in this particular domain, at least. So Fabian's answer to that was, and I quote from an article of his, "Unethical values of charismatics and mystics can be and often are a powerful source of the critique of ethical systems. Such critiques can be ethically quite disturbing, especially when they are realized in and as action that doesn't make them any the less worthy of sustained contemplation." Charismatics, as far as charismatics are concerned, Fabian argued that societies need them in times of crisis to break their conventions and renew their ethical systems and to motivate followers to change their ways. Interestingly, while the mystics are much better received in the psychedelic field, Fabian is more uneasy with the mystics, saying that their function is less clear because they withdraw from rather than challenge the moral order, and also serve as they also serve as ethical irritants and have played important roles in the history of ethical transvaluation. So he writes, from a functionalist point of view, a bit of systemic irritation is a good thing, but the mystic must remain eccentric. Otherwise, the system would fall apart because it needs some sort of moral order. And the charismatic at least recreates moral order, whereas the mystic is just kind of, stays, sort of cultivates some form of detachment towards it. So the mystic can only be tolerated or revered if they remain marginal. So, in psychedelic culture, we have a more favorable view of charismatics than of mystics. And for me, the question is basically, what is the value of the consensual ethical system seems obvious, but what are the trade-offs? In what ways, if any, do we want to preserve a space for charismatics and mystics who diverge from social norms and the newly codified ethics of psychedelic therapy? So that's basically the question I would love to discuss in the 15 minutes that we have left.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. And really touched upon a number of ideas that I hoped it would when we invited you as well. So I'm glad about that. Um, I've got a couple of questions, and then if anybody else wants to jump in. Uh, so I'm interested. There's this idea about psychedelics as being sort of non-specific amplifiers or sort of, liberating something. There's an open question that I know Professor Oliver Davis has sort of looked at about, you know, where this newness is sort of coming from. Is this all suggestion from the outside? Is this a sort of, auto suggestion from a sort of like other within kind of thing? Um,
What kind of newness do you mean?
uh, well, this question of, you know, did Leary begin as a charismatic and become more charismatic, or did the psychedelic induce it? Did
Hmm. Yeah,
Hoffman
yeah.
start as a mystic and the psychedelic amplified it, or did it sort of create it in him? What do you think?
I mean, you know this uh, letter between Huxley and Osmond after they had first met Timothy Leary, and they were both a little disturbed by what a stiff professor type he was. Um, and and
Okay.
they quickly had to correct their impression. But I wonder if they just misjudged him or if they had basically still met the old Leary, right? The person who had not become I mean, he had had his psilocybin experience at that point, and had returned from Mexico to Harvard and started his work there. Otherwise, they would not have connected with him in the first place. But he was still a very different character than the one that he eventually became. And I do think, that for, because of the mechanisms that I described, um, it is something that can drive particular personalities into this charismatic mode. And I mean, I think in the literature on charisma, it's also not that somebody just has charisma. The charisma emerges at a certain point, and it can also go away again, right? It's not like you this is a gift that just stays with you. There needs to be a certain cultural moment, because charisma is a relationship, right? It is something that happens between the charismatic and their followers, and this is only possible at certain points in time. And I think Leary was the right man in the right place in a way to become a leading figure in this. I think the Hoffman story is very different. I mean, Hoffman had his, or says he had this mystical experience as a child, and it shaped him. I'm sure if he hadn't discovered LSD, it would have, played a much more subdued role in his life, and he would not have become this, profoundly, well, kind of public mystic, right? The way in which he would, speak at public events about his mystical intuitions. I mean, that would not have happened if he had just been another natural product chemist working for a Swiss pharmaceutical corporation.
Hmm. Um, Also, this idea of sort of unethical positions. Of course, we're a group interested in psychoanalysis. Um, and you know, very sort of archaic model of, psychoanalytic therapy is the freeing up of libido through loosening the restrictions of the superego kind of thing. Um, and psychedelics can be conceived in one way, of course, of increasing access to sort of primary process thinking and that kind of stuff. Um, if you take it a bit further to like Lacan, there's a question of whether the sort of name of the father or the sort of founding principle of, you know, ethics and you know societal prohibitions, this kind of thing, is sort of paused for a moment or for a time, and then could sort of come back. But the question there is like, you know, if that name of the father, these prohibitions, these restrictions are sort of broken apart, are they broken apart for good and then need to be sort of re-knotted in a way where the person, rather than having a kind of subjected relationship to laws and morals, actually subjectivizes them and takes them on themselves? So, what I'm sort of asking is, do you think that across the three people that you put forward, all of them through the psychedelic experience get confronted with a sort of um, lack of foundation of morality, a sort of, unethical kind of experience beyond good and evil, that some of them then sort of run with, and some of them sort of deny and sort of fall back upon or subjectivize a sort of moral position that's more similar to the one that they broke down. Are psychedelics.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, Hoffman, I really think, as I said, was more of a mystic who I mean, he made no effort to gather followers and get them to live in a particular way. But both Leary and Wittmer made Leary more experimentally, Wittmer much more consistently created these sect-like followings. I mean, in Leary's case, it was basically just a short period of his life when he had people around him at Millbrook where, they really created a new form of life with all sorts of rules around it and so on, right? So this was kind of the charismatic who broke with the old social order and created a new experimental one at Millbrook. And it was short-lived, and as I said, Leary also was very much a trickster. So he would constantly, I mean, he did not assert that authority in a very authoritarian manner, right? There is a lot of self-ironic backpedaling, and and the whole purpose is to liberate others, you know, um, let them do their own thing, and so on. In Wittmer's case, it seems, I mean, they really created a lasting community. I mean, the sort of this Kirschblütengemeinde has basically existed for I don't know, 25 years or something like that. And, people are like community members, and there is, people who experienced it as very oppressive, and we eventually started talking to the media about, what they perceived as, abusive relationships in the sect context and so on. But that really is about the creation of a new and lasting social order in this space. And there you have a new name of the father, if you want to put it in Lacanian terms.
Yeah, thank you. Is that question of, is the psychedelic experience at least potentially therapeutic because of the unethical experience beyond good and evil that it could provide? I also want to open the floor to others.
I guess I was thinking about how Max Weber was also talking about the disenchantment that comes along with all the bureaucratization of society. So I was wondering what you think about the possibility of psychedelic experiences potentially becoming disenchanted within clinical contexts, with all the rules that surround ethical procedures, etc.
Yeah, I very much think of the psychedelic renaissance as a disenchantment, because it's the two forms of rationalization that Weber was interested in, right? It's the scientific rationalization and the bureaucratic rationalization, and both are driven forward very forcefully through the biomedical apparatus. But I think the humanities are also playing a role in it by, I think in many ways uh, they as critical humanities scholars are trying to enforce moral codes around psychedelics. They participate in a rationalization of ethics. The bioethicists, for sure. I mean, that's basically the name of the game in bioethics, to rationalize, to come up with a clear-cut code and have like certain procedures to determine how to go about clinical applications. So yeah, I think rationalization is definitely the name of the game in this.
Sorry
I think
if
the interesting question. Sorry, I think the interesting question is basically if the effects of psychedelics somehow resist that, right? If I mean, can you have these these very strange experiences that these drugs induce, and actually rein them in, both with scientific explanations and the sort of bureaucratized ethics frameworks.
And I've been reading also Dialectic of Enlightenment, and there the authors speak about how science itself can kind of recreate a kind of form of magic. And we have the discussion about psychedelics as a silver bullet. So, for instance, the rationalization then leads to people being expected to get better with 1 or 2 sessions.
Yeah, I mean, there is the hype, and the hype is, certainly it's also a part of the scientific system to generate grant money, and it's part of the capitalist system around the startups to find investors and all of that. And so, I mean, there certainly is some kind of, well, I guess you could call it magical thinking, but ultimately, it's still being framed in a natural scientific language of disenchantment.
Yeah. Nicolas, that was a really great talk. So thank you. My name is Farhad. Um, and I agree with what you just said, I think, about whether the experience of psychedelics will change or whether its impacts will remain the same in a time when there's an increasing rationalization of the entire process. And I think that's what maybe we're kind of seeing right now. My question was a little bit about, I mean, what you spoke about today was in primarily Western societies, the way, um, psychedelics have kind of created these figures of authority or charismatic authority. Um, and I was wondering whether you've done any comparative studies with other cultures where psychedelics are are used or have been used for a long time, and who those figures are in those particular cultures, like the position of the shaman within a culture for certain people, or whether, yeah, I don't know if you've done if you know much about that.
I do know the Amazonianist literature a little bit, but only as literature.
Yeah.
And in this paper that I mentioned, psychedelic therapy as a form of life, we end with a comparison with that literature because Alex Garin did some work with at the Shipibo ayahuasca retreat, so he knows that world and that scholarship much better than I do. I'm not sure. I wouldn't venture into applying these concepts in this Amazonianist context. I have a sense, as I said, the Weber paper on the 3 types of legitimate authority was basically about charisma and the bureaucratic authority as 2 poles of modern
Yeah.
social orders. And I think in non-modern social orders, this will play out very differently. And my sense is also from the way I understand the role of shamans in Amazonian society, I don't think that they necessarily play the role of charismatics. Because these are, often egalitarian societies that put a lot of emphasis on a version of autonomy that is quite different from the autonomy that is in the background of bioethics thinking. So that's something that we wrote about in this paper. So I think it would be very interesting, to have more of a comparison. And generally, I think it would be really helpful to, look at how psychedelics are integrated in these societies, just as a point of comparison. I don't think that they can provide a model,
No.
but understanding, how psychedelics can have a more stable presence in different forms of life would be, and stabilizing presence in different forms of life would be quite helpful for us to think about.
Yeah, what came to mind was like Durkheim's mechanical and organic solidarity and the role that psychedelics plays in those two forms of organization, at least. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
Unfortunately, I have to rush off. I have an appointment and need to catch a train to get there. But it was very, very nice talking with you.
Thank you.
I hope we'll find some way to continue somehow.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
Thanks for the
Thank you.
invitation. Bye-bye.